Hello and welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples of the Russian Empire. I'm your host, JP Bristow, and this is Season 1, Forest, the Steppe and the Birth of the Russian Empire, Episode 117, Moscow and its Neighbours. A quick word before we begin. Spotify has notified me of some changes coming this month. It will be replacing subscriptions with a new program called memberships. Mostly this involves them adding a bunch of AI slop features like everyone keeps trying to force into everything these days, but it also means that a Spotify account will now be required to subscribe. I assume people subscribing through Spotify most likely already do have an account, but just in case, you might need to look into that. It's been a while since we surveyed our region, but before Ivan changes everything, we need to get a good idea of how things stand. As we've heard, Vasily II had begun his reign by losing most of the influence his father, Dmitry Donskoy, had over the other kняжества, but had ended it in the strongest position that any Grand Knyaz of Moscow had had to date. This still did not make unification of the northeast inevitable, but it did mean that Ivan would have to be a truly incompetent ruler to not capitalize on the foundations that his father had built. By the end of Vasily's reign, the other kняжества, Tver, Ryazan, Rostov, and Yaroslavl, and the cities of Novgorod, Pskov, and Vyatka, which was called Klinov at this point, were still independent, but they had, to one degree or another, agreed to acknowledge Moscow's leadership. Of course, they had done so before and then reasserted their independence, but this time they would not be allowed to go back. So, let's begin Ivan's reign by surveying where things stand. The Grand Kняжество of Moscow itself, the lands ruled directly by Ivan and the appanages held by his brothers, now extended from the Volga to the Oka. In the north, it included Bielo-Ozero, Kostroma, and Galich, with more recently acquired towns along the Sukhona River into the northern Dvina corridor, as far as Ust-Yug. In the east, Moscow controlled land on both sides of the Volga that had previously been part of the Kняжество of Suzdal, as far as Nizhny Novgorod. In the west, it extended to Rzhev, the upper waters of the Volga, forming a wedge separating Tver and Lithuania. Tver was the largest and most important of the independent kняжества. Its ruler also called himself a Grand Knyaz. Tver was on the upper part of the Volga, between Zubtsov in the west and Kashin in the south. The kняжества essentially formed a buffer between Novgorod to the north, Moscow to the south, and Lithuania to the west. This geographical position gave it useful and lucrative choke points on the trade routes between Novgorod and the eastern Russian cities. If you can remember back to the days of Ivan I, Tver had risen rapidly to take the title of Grand Knyaz of Vladimir, but had then staged a disastrous revolt against the Tatars. This revolt gave Ivan I Karlita his chance to prove his worth to the Mongols when he led the punitive force against it. Tver was harshly punished and took 40 years to recover sufficient strength to reassert its independence. Under Knyaz Mikhail Alexandrovich, Tver had once again tried to make itself the leading knyazhestvo. He had married Algirdas' sister and formally concluded an alliance. But the Lithuanians were busy elsewhere. When Mikhail needed them to attack Moscow, they sent forces that were too few to be effective. When Dmitry of Moscow managed to gather most of the other knyazhestva for a combined attack on Tver, Algirdas failed to turn up to help defend his ally. Although Dmitry of Moscow forced Tver to swear allegiance to him following this victory, Moscow had not really been able to enforce this in practice. Tver had several generations of competent leadership, and for another century it managed to use Lithuania as a counterbalance to Moscow's influence. Knyaz Boris Alexandrovich concluded treaties with Vytautas and then Kazimierz of Poland, acknowledging Lithuania as protector. These maneuvers came to an end when Vasily II won the civil war in Moscow. Boris saw his best chance at preserving independence in alignment with Moscow, broke his treaty with Lithuania, and signed a new treaty with Moscow agreeing to maintain a common foreign policy. Boris died and was succeeded by his son Mikhail the year before Ivan III took over in Moscow. Tver was independent, prosperous, and had avoided fragmentation, but its geographical position between Moscow and Novgorod will not work in its favour in the long term. The knyazheство to the south of Moscow, Ryazan, had also declared itself grand. It ran from the Oka in the north to the Don and Tisna rivers. By the time of Ivan's succession, Ryazan was relatively weak. As the nearest knyazhestvo to the steppe, it had always borne the brunt of raids and Mongol forced conscriptions. To add to this, after the city of Ryazan had been destroyed in the initial Mongol conquest, the knyazhestvo had two competing centres. One was then called Pereyaslavl, sometimes Pereyaslavl-Ryazansky to distinguish it from the other Pereyaslavls we've already encountered, and later renamed as the Ryazan that still exists today. The other was Bronsk. This rivalry often got as far as open conflict and impeded the development of the knyazhestvo, allowing Moscow to interfere in its affairs. Ryazan only began to recover and struggle for more independence in the 15th century. Like Tver, it was assisted in this by a competent Grand Knyaz, Ivan Fyodorovich, who ruled from 1427 to 1456 and made overtures to Lithuania, going as far as a treaty with Vytautas requiring Ryazan to fight for Lithuania in the event of a war with Moscow. However, as with Tver, it seems that Vytautas never provided much to support the alliance, and Ryazan drifted back to Moscow. When the civil war started, Ivan Fyodorovich had to choose a side, and he chose Vasily. After Vasily's victory, they concluded a pact of friendship in which Ryazan agreed that it would consult Moscow over its relations with Lithuania. For once, this pact held. The two kняжества continued to develop economic and political ties. When Ivan Fyodorovich died, his son Vasily was only 8, and rather than establishing a regency, he willed the protection of his kняжество and heir to Moscow. Vasily took in the young knyaz and appointed his governor to Ryazan, as well as passing it to his wife when he died. Ivan III gave young Vasily back his throne in 1463, and he married Ivan's sister Anna the following year. From this point on, Ryazan becomes effectively a loyal Moscow vassal, although remaining formally independent. The other two independent kняжества, Rostov and Yaroslavl, were much smaller. Rostov had once been a major kняжество, but it had been fragmented through inheritances, including the one that created Yaroslavl, which had formerly been a part of it. Most of the other parts of the original Rostov had already been absorbed by Moscow under Dmitry Donskoy or Vasily II, and what remained was encircled by Moscow territories. For several decades already, they had effectively become vassals of Moscow. The ruling family of Rostov was still large and had been moving into taking service with Moscow while retaining their hereditary estates, making them an early example of the military service class that is going to become characteristic of Russia. At Ivan III's accession, Yaroslavl was ruled by Knyaz Alexander Fyodorovich. He had supported Vasily II throughout the civil war, even once being captured along with his wife by the forces of Vasily Kosoi. As in the other cases, after Vasily's victory, this support resulted in increased Moscow influence and the erosion of Yaroslavl's independence. One of the towns Vasily left to Andrei the Elder had until that time been a Yaroslavl possession, and there are other documents from Vasily's reign that show him disposing of territories that belonged to Yaroslavl as he saw fit, although he did make payments to the knyaz. We have the usual issues with scant records, but the chronicle suggests that there was a party in Moscow that had been agitating for the annexation of Yaroslavl for some time, certainly under Vasily. A boyar named Alexei Poluetkovich is described as having of old asked Vasily II not to leave Yaroslavl in the hands of its knyazes. Alexei appears to have conducted some kind of negotiations and drafted documentation on behalf of Moscow, proceeding on the basis of political claims rather than through open coercion. The procedure was not completed before Ivan's accession, but it was already underway. The chronicle gives us a rather strange description of how it ended. In early March 1463, healings were reported to have taken place at the tombs of the knyazes in the monastery of the Transfiguration in Yaroslavl. Like other knyazes, the rulers of Yaroslavl promoted a cult around themselves. After this, the knyaz signed his domains over to Ivan III in exchange for the grant of estates. The chronicle makes an untranslatable joke linked to the healings and mocking Alexander for the loss of his patrimony. There's some debate over how and when the handover occurred, since Knyaz Alexander continued to live in Yaroslavl until he died in 1471. But Ivan was already referring to Yaroslavl as my patrimony in 1464. Some historians regard it as a process that completed in 1471. The settlement involved the knyazes of Yaroslavl transferring their votchina, their hereditary patrimony, to the Grand Knyaz of Moscow. A votchina was the most valuable property that there was in early modern Russia. It was the basis of dynastic authority and gave the holder the right to collect tribute, judge the inhabitants, appoint officials, maintain an armed retinue, and to dispose of the settlements on it. In exchange for this transfer, Ivan granted substantial estates to the knyaz and his family. But these estates were not votchina. They were held on the basis of the Grand Knyaz's grant, not hereditary right. The agreements they signed with Ivan state that they no longer had the right to collect tribute or to act as judges in the most serious cases. They remained knyazes. They and their peers become the knyazes that in the next century English travellers will arrive and explain as being the Russian equivalent of dukes, if you remember that discussion from many episodes back. They provided service to the Grand Knyaz and later the Tsar, and received revenue and aristocratic precedence, but they no longer ruled. Why would Knyaz Alexander agree to this deal, which sounds like a big reduction in status for him? Well, it was an acknowledgement of the practical circumstances. As I said a few minutes ago, the old Rostov Knyazhestvo had already been broken up, as inheritance fragmented that votchina. Much had been absorbed, the remainder was small and weak, and there were no real options for it to get stronger. Moscow, on the other hand, had suddenly emerged as a genuine power. When Alexander looked into the future, he saw the prospect of conquest, which could leave his family with nothing, or a knyaz with multiple sons and heirs, causing the complete disintegration of the knyazhestvo and a slow decline into poverty. The deal with Ivan exchanged sovereignty for security. Alexander lived out his days in Yaroslavl in peace. His heirs retained status, importance, and wealth, and had the chance to achieve more of all of those within an expanding Muscovy. Alexander's son Daniil went on to become a governor, commander of armies for Ivan and Vasily III, and a member of the Moscow boyar elite. Other branches of the Yaroslavl ruling family enjoyed similar success. So, while Ivan negotiated the annexation from a position of overwhelming strength, it was a deal where both sides benefited. In 1474, Knyaz Ivan Ivanovich of Rostov took a similar deal and sold his knyazhestvo to Ivan. The independent cities were in a somewhat different situation to the knyazhestvo. Novgorod was, of course, the most important and will be Ivan's biggest challenge. In addition to the city and its surrounds, it controlled a vast hinterland in the northeast, where it traded for furs and other goods with the primarily non-Slavic inhabitants. This area ranged all the way from Finland to the Urals. The wealthiest part of its territory was the Zavolotchye, the northern Dvina basin beyond Vologda and Ust-Yug. Further east, into the northern Urals, lay Perm, Pechora, and Yugra. In the far north was Tre on the White Sea, a distance of well over 1,000 kilometers from Novgorod. Novgorod's western neighbor was Pskov on the Velikaya River, with good links to all the regional waterways and the Baltic Sea. Its location between Novgorod, Livonia, and Lithuania made it a buffer between Novgorod and the west, but it had successfully maintained its independence, often defeating numerically superior invading forces. Pskov had begun as a colony of Novgorod. It had been governed by Novgorodian officials, but had not participated in their election at the Novgorod Virtue. With the arrival of the Teutonic Order, Pskov had found Novgorod to be an unreliable defender, which had resulted in the city gradually taking over its own affairs until Novgorod acknowledged their independence in 1348. Pskov established a similar system of government to Novgorod, electing their city officials and inviting a knyaz to serve as their military leader. However, the church refused to give them their own bishop, and they remained ecclesiastically dependent on Novgorod. Pskov, as I've mentioned in previous episodes, periodically invited Lithuanian knyazes as it tried to balance between east and west. However, the city officials found Vytautas too ambitious and controlling. The more he tried to take over the city, the more they turned to Moscow when they needed a knyaz. In the latter part of Vasily II's reign, power was beginning to swing from the Virtue to the knyaz. By the time of Ivan's accession, the city was formally independent, but Moscow controlled its foreign affairs. Vyatka, which Vasily had left to Ivan, had submitted to Moscow, but still had its own Virtue and was effectively autonomous. Vyatka, or Klinov at this time, lay on the upper reaches of the Vyatka River. Like Pskov, it had initially been established as a colony of Novgorod. Under the Tatars, they had been an independent tribute payer and had also preyed on their neighbours' shipping as it passed along nearby waterways. They pop up in the Chronicle from time to time, usually in complaints about them refusing to do what Moscow asked them, or raiding Ust-Yug or another neighbouring region. It will take Ivan until 1489 to fully subjugate them. Algirdas had declared his intention to rule all of Rus, to gather the Rus, as the phrase came to be. Vytautas had continued this ambition. We do not have any evidence that any ruler of Moscow before Ivan voiced this ambition for themselves. Indeed, it would have been rather laughable if they had, given Moscow's limitations. As we've heard in previous episodes, Lithuania ruled its Ruthenian possessions with a fairly light hand. It avoided disturbing the old order, and until recently tolerated difference. The Grand Duke retained the loyalty of his Ruthenian nobles, although it's anyone's guess what the ordinary people thought. The southwestern knyazstva, Chernihiv, Pereyaslav, Kyiv, and Podolia, had suffered more political and economic disruption from the Mongol conquest. The larger knyazstva had been broken up. None of them was big or powerful enough to take a leading role as Moscow or Tver had tried to in the northeast. Thanks to intermarriage and Gediminid assimilation, there was no independent dynasty that could form a centre of resistance to the Lithuanians, even if they had been unhappy. Even Vytautas' late attempts at centralization had not changed this. It was quite easy for most Ruthenians to be Lithuanian vassals. They did not even need to be formally annexed. An agreement to provide military service in exchange for protection was usually enough. Some historians would argue that in the border regions in particular, the knyazes were more within a Lithuanian sphere of influence than its subjects. And this all meant that many of them were quite content. As Moscow expands, it begins openly trying to persuade the Ruthenians to defect from Vilnius to them, but it does not find many willing to do so. In the south, two important new powers were emerging alongside Moscow's rapid ascent: the Khanates of Kazan and Crimea. Neither of them is an existential threat in the way that the Great Horde of old had been, but both were significant military powers capable of causing major problems. Kazan, as the closest, was the most significant for Moscow. As we shall see, diplomacy and wars with these new Tatar states will take up an awful lot of Ivan and Vasily's energy. Beyond these neighbours, the Teutonic Order was in decline, and for the first part of Ivan's reign it was at war with Poland. Over the whole 70 years of Ivan and Vasily's reigns, they are a threat only once, when they try to attack Pskov while Moscow is in the middle of a campaign against the Tatars. Looking around, it seems that we can already get an idea of how things will go. In the northeast, we have already stepped firmly onto the path of unification. Novgorod is the last bastion of true independence, and the conflict there is inevitable. In the west and southwest, Moscow faces serious obstacles and appears to have little to offer to compete with Lithuania. In the south, it will need to decide what its place is in the world of the steppe after the Great Horde. We know that the chronicles rarely show us much about a person. They were written by churchmen and depict a providential world, telling the story of how God or the devil made things happen, not how men planned and executed. This is true of Ivan. There is no description of any policy consciously set out, no discussion of his aims or motives, just the facts. But for Ivan III, as historian John Fennell puts it, quote, "There is little or nothing to help the historian elaborate policies except for the astonishingly logical sequence of events. Campaigns, annexations, marriages, embassies, executions, reforms, all occur as if by some preconceived plan. The purpose of each event becomes clear when viewed in perspective from the end of his reign. Nothing seems to have been accidental, carelessly planned, or even mistimed. All events appear to point in one direction. These were by no means haphazard occurrences. They were steps in the path of a statesman of vision, and above all of astounding single-mindedness. For Ivan III, more than any of his predecessors or followers, knew precisely where he was going. He knew his goal, the means at his disposal, and the obstacles to be encountered." End quote. That goal, which he largely achieves, was to make Moscow the leading power in Eastern Europe. Thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.